Hello and welcome to topic 2 of Advanced Financial Accounting, accounting for public sector organizations. This is a subject area that is typically not covered in advanced financial accounting classes across Canada, but it is tested by CPA Canada, not in a very big way, but you should be aware of public sector organization accounting, um, at least the important points to note. So what are public sector organizations might be the first question in your mind. These include government. The governments must follow the public sector accounting handbook. Government-owned businesses must follow IFRS. Not-for-profit organizations owned by the government must follow the public sector accounting handbook, either with or without the 4200 series. Other government organizations may follow IFRS or the Public Sector Accounting Handbook. Government partnerships, depending on the nature of the partnership and the partners, the applicable accounting standards may vary. Now, what are some of the key standards applicable to public sector organizations? We will look at 5. First of all is Public Standards 1000, which deals with financial statement concepts, PS 1100, which deals with financial statement objectives, PS 1201, financial statement presentation, PS 1300, the concept of the financial reporting entity, and then specific accounting standards that apply only to the government not-for-profit organizations, and that's the 4200 series, PS 4200 to 4270. PS 1000, financial statement concepts. It identifies the key users and their information needs. Government financial statements, they serve the interests of a variety of users, which includes the public, legislators, counselors, investors, analysts, and other governments. And these users are interested in the state of the government's finances, its financial viability, both in the short and long run, its revenues and financing sources, the allocation and use of its economic resources, the nature and extent of its economic activities, and the quality of its financial management. In particular, government financial statements need to report the information required by users to help them make assessments and judgments concerning government financial operations and management. So in some ways, similar to the for-profit businesses or the not-for-profit organizations that we saw in topic 1, but there are subtle differences just given the size and scale of government operations. PS 1100, financial statement objectives. Financial statements should provide an accounting of the full nature and extent of the financial affairs and resources which the government controls, including those relating to the activities of its agencies and enterprises. And the financial statements should present information to describe the government's financial position at the end of the accounting period. And such information will be used in evaluating the government's ability to finance its activities and to meet its liabilities and contractual obligations, and its ability to provide future services to whichever level of government it deals with, federal government or the provincial government or the municipal governments. Financial statements should present information to describe the changes in a government's financial position. Such information should be useful in evaluating the sources, the allocation and consumption of the government's recognized economic resources in the accounting period, how the activities of the accounting period have affected the net debt of the government, and how the government financed its activities in the accounting period and how it met its cash requirements. Now, it may seem kind of dry and banal, but think about the COVID-19 situation and the federal government's actions to help support millions of Canadians by way of the CERB and the rent relief and the wage relief and so on. And the result has been a massive increase of the government debt. I'm sure there will be people waiting to see what the actual impact is going to be on the government's net debt and how um, able the federal government will be to continue to provide the kind of assistance that it has in recent past if the COVID situation were to persist in the future, especially next year. So this isn't something to completely, think of as it doesn't affect me. It does because the size and magnitude of the government debt ultimately has an impact on the well-being of every citizen. Financial statements of the government should demonstrate the accountability of a government for the resources, obligations, and financial affairs for which it's responsible. By providing information that's useful in evaluating the financial results of the government's management of its resources, obligations, and financial affairs in the said accounting period, and assessing whether resources were administered by the government in accordance with the limits established by the appropriate legislative authorities. The limits are typically in the form of the budget. So the budget is passed and the budget sort of imposes limits. There are times when such limits are they have to be relaxed or amended. So again, referring to the COVID scenario, the federal government had to engage with the parliament to get approval for the emergency measures, including the CERB. Without such approval, the government will not have been able to proceed. PS 1201, financial statement preparation, presentation. It basically identifies the required financial statements. Now, these include 5 financial statements. There's the statement of financial position, basically the balance sheet, a statement of operations, which provides details of the revenues and expenses for a given period, a statement of remeasurement gains and losses. So this is an interesting one because the government also has the CPP and a lot of pension obligations that the government has, and in some of them there are remeasurement given the changes in actuarial table values. There can be changes, so the statement of remeasurement gains and losses would capture that. There's the statement of change in net debt. So it is unfortunately the reality that for our federal government at least, um, it has had to borrow its way through the past budgets, and the net result has been that the government has more liabilities than it has assets. And so the situation for the government is essentially that of negative equity, and that is called net debt for the government. So a statement of changes in net debt, and finally a statement of cash flow. PS 1300, financial reporting entity, it requires consolidation of financial statements of all government-controlled organizations other than government business organizations. And for the government business organizations, a modified equity method is applied. The reporting on a consolidated basis presents summary information that aggregates the individual financial statements of the entities that comprise the reporting entity. So it could be, let's say, the federal government of Canada, um, Consolidation is a method of accounting that combines the accounts of governmental units line by line on a uniform basis of accounting and eliminates any intergovernmental unit balances and transactions. In this course, later on, we'll be learning about consolidation for businesses and companies. So this is kind of a sneak preview of what that is about. It is a combination of the accounts of various companies, or in this case, governmental units, following a uniform basis of accounting. The key thing to remember is that any kind of um, governmental unit balances and transactions must be eliminated. And the accounting for government business enterprises by the equity method, it actually helps in avoiding the mixing or the commingling of the independently managed business enterprises' budgets and actual results with those of governmental units on a line-by-line basis. And it also avoids including the government business enterprises' gross debt with that of the government units, because the government business enterprise is expected to repay that debt from its own revenues. The government of Canada will not be obligated to repay the debt of a government-owned business. For example, Canada Post, if it has debt, the government of Canada would expect that Canada Post will repay its own liabilities from its own revenues. And that's the reason why we do not consolidate um, government-owned business enterprises numbers with those of government financial statements. The famous 4200 series, these apply to all governments and those organizations that consider it to be the appropriate source of GAAP with respect to their objectives and circumstances. And we will not get into excessive details, but for understanding what or just knowing, being aware of what these relate to, PS 4200 speaks of financial statement presentation. PS 4210 relates to contributions, revenue recognition. PS 4220 relates to contributions receivable. PS 4230 relates to capital assets. 4240 relates to collections. 4250 relates to reporting, controlled and related entities. 4260 relates to disclosure of related party transactions. And 4270 relates to disclosure of allocated expenses. And in case you're getting a sense of deja vu, I assure you, yes, you have seen these very sets of standards when we were talking in topic one about not-for-profit organizations. So whatever you learned in that topic, topic one, the public sector handbook has similar requirements. So that's the reason why we did not specifically choose to go through each one of these in details. The details you can very well recap by watching the lecture video on topic one, not-for-profit organizations. Here's a look at the annual financial report of the Government of Canada, the most recent one I could find for the fiscal year 2018-2019, prepared by the Department of Finance. The highlights of the report: the government for the year 2018-2019 had posted a budgetary deficit of $14 billion. In contrast, I believe the deficit projected for the current year is already over $280 billion in the aftermath of COVID. So you can just think about the magnitude of the impact that COVID has had. The federal debt to GDP ratio was about 31%. I'm sure that has massively gone up. Yes, the government received an unmodified audit opinion from the Auditor General of Canada on its consolidated financial statements. Good to know. Here's a look at the consolidated statement of operations. So for the year 2019, and these numbers are in millions, okay? So total revenues, the actual total revenues for the government of Canada for 2019 were $332 billion. The total expenses were $346 billion, resulting in an annual deficit of just under $14 billion. The accumulated deficit, though, because the government of Canada had been accumulating a deficit in the past, the accumulated deficit at the end of 2019 was $685 billion. And then the pie charts to the right give us a sense of where primarily the revenues come from and what are the primary components of expenses. Personal income taxes account for just under half the total government revenues. Corporate income tax is about 15%. GST helps bring in about 11.5%. And then you have a mismatch of other sources of revenue. The major source or areas of expenses um, include transfers to persons, 27.8%, direct program expenses, 28.4%. Now, I would imagine these major transfers to persons number will be much higher for the current year in the aftermath of COVID. And when we look at the public debt charges, that's how much, so out of the total expenses, 6.7% related to the interest on the public debt. As public debt goes up, the chunk of the interest, the public debt charges will increase. And that's been happening in Alberta. So it's something to pay attention to for sure. Here's the look at the consolidated balance sheet for the government. Notice it's got for 2019, at the end of March 31st, 2019, the government had total liabilities worth $1.185 trillion. The accumulated deficit, 685 billion. Net debt was $772 billion. That's a lot of money owed by the government. And in 2019, the net debt actually went up by about $20 billion. For 2020, that number is going to be a baffling increase of, I would imagine, close to $300 billion. Consolidated cash flow statement. Here we go. And doesn't make for a pretty picture there, but that's what government accounting is, my friends. So without getting into too much details, this is a surface level view of what government accounting is about. And hopefully you will be able to remember some of it if you ever came across a question, a brief question in Core 1 of your CPA program. So here's Harjinder signing out for topic 2.